Without waiting for the family to process what was happening, he raised his hand to signal the waitress. She shuffled over, her expression a mix of suspicion and confusion. Barron didn't give her time to ask questions. "Bring them everything on the menu," he said, with the kind of authority that made people listen, even if they didn't want to. He reached into his coat, pulled out a gleaming gold card, and dropped it on the table like it weighed a ton. "Oh, and don't forget dessert, lots of it." The waitress blinked, clearly trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank. Finally, she nodded stiffly and walked off, her heels clicking against the floor. The family stared at Barron, their shock so palpable you could almost feel it in the air. The grandmother was the first to break the silence. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if kindness from a stranger was a concept too foreign to fully accept. Barron hesitated, his usual confidence faltering for a moment. "Why not?" he said, his tone lighter than he felt. "We're all here, right? Might as well make it a night to remember." He tried to play it cool, but there was something uncomfortably warm about the way the boy was looking at him, with awe, like Barron had just done something heroic. But that warmth didn't last long. The mood shifted the second the door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air, and three men who looked like they belonged anywhere but here. They were rough around the edges, dressed in dirty flannel and jeans, their faces set in permanent scowls. One of them, the tallest, immediately locked eyes with Barron and let out a low chuckle. "Well, well, look who it is. Fancy boy out here slumming it?" His voice was loud enough to make heads turn, but Barron didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. The man stepped closer, a sneer spreading across his face. "You lost or something? This ain't your kind of place, kid. Why don't you head back to wherever you came from before you get too comfortable?" The tension in the room spiked. The family froze, the boy clutching his mother's arm as if to anchor himself. Even the waitress, who had just returned with a tray of food, hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Barron and the men. Barron stayed perfectly still, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the man squirm. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached for the plate of fries in front of him and slid it across the table to the boy. "Here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Fries, just like you wanted." The boy hesitated, glancing nervously at the men before reaching out to grab the plate. His small hands trembled slightly, but he didn't let go. Barron gave him a small nod, then turned his attention back to the men. "Now," Barron said, his voice louder, cutting through the thick air. "What were you saying?" The tallest man took another step forward, his jaw tightening. "I'm saying," he growled, "you don't belong here, so why don't you make it easy for everyone and—" "Sit down," Barron interrupted, his tone as cold as the wind outside. The man stopped mid-step, clearly not expecting that response. For a split second, the room felt like it might explode, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. But Barron didn't move. He stayed seated, his gaze locked on the man like he wasn't just some teenager, but someone who could actually make him back down. The man hesitated, his bravado faltering. Behind him, his friends exchanged uneasy glances, as if silently questioning whether this was a fight worth picking. Barron leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He reached for another plate and pushed it toward the boy, who was now staring at him like he was some kind of superhero. The man let out a low growl, but didn't say anything else. Instead, he turned and stormed out, his friends trailing behind him. The door slammed shut, and the room exhaled collectively, the tension dissipating like smoke. Barron turned back to the family, his smirk softening into a genuine smile. "Enjoy your dinner," he said simply, grabbing his drink and taking a sip as if nothing had happened. The tension in the cafe hit its peak. The men weren't done, not by a long shot. One of them, a wiry guy with a smirk that could curdle milk, leaned down over the woman. His presence loomed, an ugly mix of arrogance and mockery. "So," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the whole cafe to hear, "you found yourself a rich boy to pay for your meal? Nice move. Guess some people just get all the luck, huh?" He chuckled, a sound so grating it made the boy flinch. Barron had been watching from his seat, his fingers drumming lightly on the table, but at that moment, he stopped. Slowly, he stood, his tall frame commanding the room's attention. His cold, calm expression made the man straighten slightly, unsure of what was coming next. "How about," Barron said, his voice steady and clear, "you take your friends and leave, right now?" The man blinked, caught off guard by the sheer confidence in Barron's tone, but then his smirk returned, though it didn't reach his eyes this time. "Oh, big man, huh? You think you can just—" "Yeah, I do," Barron cut him off, his voice dropping just enough to make it clear he wasn't here to play games. For a second, the man hesitated. Barron didn't move, didn't flinch. His unshakable calm made the man falter, but pride kept him rooted in place. He stepped closer, his shoulders squared, trying to reclaim whatever shred of authority he thought he had. That's when the cafe door swung open. Barron's bodyguard stepped in, and it was like the room shifted. The man was a wall of muscle and professionalism, his sharp eyes scanning the scene and immediately locking onto Barron. "Is there a problem here?" the bodyguard asked, his voice low and steady but carrying an edge that said he didn't expect an answer. The man's bravado crumbled. He muttered something unintelligible under his breath, glanced at his friends, and jerked his head toward the door. They followed him out, their exit punctuated by the slam of the door and a gust of cold air. The cafe was quiet again, the kind of silence that comes after a storm. At the table, the grandmother clasped her hands together and looked up at Barron, her expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper. "You didn't just save our dinner, boy," she said softly, her voice carrying weight. "You showed us something. Not everyone is like them. Not everyone sees us like that." Barron froze for a moment, her words hitting harder than he expected. He wasn't used to this kind of sincerity, and it threw him off balance. But then he chuckled, his usual smirk returning. "Food is food," he said with a shrug. "Bullies, they're everywhere. You just gotta know how to handle them." The boy, who had been silent through the whole ordeal, looked up at Barron with wide eyes. "That was awesome," he said simply, his voice full of awe. Barron gave him a small nod, but he didn't say anything. The family finished their meal quietly, occasionally glancing at him as if he were some kind of mythical creature. When they finally stood to leave, the mother hesitated, then turned to Barron. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady but laced with emotion. Barron just waved her off. "Enjoy the rest of your night," he said, his tone light. As they walked out into the snowy night, Barron leaned back in his chair, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't something he could put into words, but it was there, undeniable. Behind the counter, the waitresses were whispering to each other, throwing occasional glances his way. One of them, braver than the rest, finally murmured, "Is that Trump's kid? No way." Barron caught it, of course. He glanced over at them, his smirk widening just enough to make them blush. Let them think whatever they want, he thought, his mind unusually clear. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. He finished his drink slowly, savoring the quiet, and then stood, tossing a generous tip on the table before heading out into the cold. What would you do in Barron's place? Share your thoughts in the comments, like, and share to spread kindness. This story highlights real issues to inspire change. Your opinion matters. They walked in like they owned the place, mocking a family already at their lowest. What they didn't expect. A sharp-tongued teenager ready to flip the script. Let's just say, by the time they left, no one was laughing. But to understand how it all went down, we need to start at the beginning. New York City, December. The streets were alive with chaos. Snow swirling in the air, headlights reflecting off icy sidewalks, and the endless hum of a city that never slept. It was the kind of night that felt larger than life, both magical and unsettling at the same time. Barron Trump, 17 years old and tall enough to blend into any crowd of adults, slipped out of his SUV without a word. His dark coat flared in the icy wind as he glanced over his shoulder at the hulking figure of his bodyguard trailing behind. "I just want a normal dinner," Barron muttered, the words half buried under the noise of the street. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. The bodyguard hesitated, but eventually let him go, hanging back like a hawk watching its prey. Barron's eyes landed on a tiny cafe at the corner, the kind of place you'd only notice if you were looking for trouble or trying to avoid being noticed yourself. Its faded sign swung creakily in the wind, and the windows were so fogged up that you could barely see inside. He pushed open the door, and a dull bell jingled overhead. The inside wasn't much better. The air smelled like burnt coffee and fried food that had been sitting too long. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the cracked vinyl seats. The kind of place that felt more like a confession booth than a diner. Perfect. Barron smirked. Scanning the room, his gaze caught on a family tucked away by the window. A woman in a frayed coat was hunched over the table, quietly counting a handful of crumpled bills. Across from her, a boy, maybe 10 years old, was practically vibrating with impatience. His voice, loud enough to cut through the muted hum of the cafe, rang out, "Mom, I just want fries. Come on, just fries." His tone was desperate, as if fries were the difference between life and death tonight. Next to him sat an older woman, her back slightly hunched, adjusting a scarf around her neck. She glanced toward the counter, where a waitress stood with crossed arms, her face a mask of disdain. The mother held out her cash, only for the waitress to shake her head and drop the bills back on the table with a look that screamed, "Not my problem." Barron's smirk faded as he watched the scene unfold. He leaned against the counter, his sharp eyes tracking every movement. The boy slumped in his seat, his shoulders drooping as his mother quickly scooped up the bills, her face tight with quiet frustration. The older woman reached out to pat her daughter's arm, but even that small gesture seemed to carry the weight of defeat. "Seriously?" Barron muttered under his breath. "They can't even get fries? What kind of dystopian nightmare is this?" He couldn't shake the image of the boy's hopeful face crumbling. Something inside him twisted, and before he could stop himself, he was already walking toward their table. "Hey," Barron said, his voice casual but loud enough to snap the mother out of her thoughts. "Did that waitress seriously just refuse to serve you?" The woman's head shot up, her eyes wide with a mix of caution and confusion. The boy, less reserved, leaned forward and squinted at Barron. "Wait," the boy said, tilting his head. "Do we know you? Are you, like, famous or something?" Barron chuckled, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Nah, man. Just another guy who hates bad service." He gestured toward the counter with a nod. "So, what's the deal? Fries too fancy for this place now?" The boy's frustration spilled over. "She said we didn't have enough money," he blurted, throwing a pointed glance at the waitress. His mother shot him a look, but he ignored it. Barron's smirk turned into a frown as he glanced back at the counter, where the waitress stood watching with thinly veiled contempt. "Right," he said, his voice low but firm. "That's not gonna work." The mother opened her mouth to protest, but Barron raised a hand. "Relax, I've got this." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and strode toward the counter. His polished shoes clicked against the worn linoleum floor, and for the first time that night, the room seemed to fall quiet. Barron didn't know why he cared so much, but one thing was clear. He wasn't about to let this slide. Barron smirked, leaning back in his seat. He thrived on moments like these, when people's expectations of him shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't his first time turning heads, but there was something about doing it in a place like this, where nobody saw it coming, that made it all the more satisfying.